Well, good morning and welcome. We'll get started. I understand that Secretary Block is caught in traffic, which comes as no surprise to those of us who fought the traffic here in the D.C. area. So we'll get started, and if he appears by the time we get through our opening statements, we can recognize him at that point or when he gets here, but we'll go ahead. Today's hearing is first that we'll try to bring the spotlight on emphasis with our engagement in our hemisphere. American business and job growth is, I think, in many respects dependent on our ability to export and to engage with countries, and for some time now, I have watched with great interest our relationships in our own hemisphere. Cuba is a part of that, and as you know, there's a bill moving in the Agricultural Committee in this regard. As I was thinking about Cuba, I got to thinking about what Coach Osborne said. You all remember Tom Osborne, former football coach at Nebraska, was here as a member one time, and he was asked what he thought about Cuba. He said, well, and I'll paraphrase what he said, I don't know much about Cuba, but if I call the same play in football 39 times in a row and it failed again, I'd try another play. This is about exploring the interest of this country, the United States of America, as it relates to our very complicated relationship with Cuba. Before I recognize our ranking member, let me do some housekeeping here. Chris Van Hollen called me last night, and he's unable to be here today because he's attending Dorothy Height's funeral because she will be interred in his district. He wanted me to read this letter and to put another letter in the record, and without objection, I'll do that. Goes as follows. Dear Chairman, thank you and Ranking Member Brady for holding today's hearing on U.S. Cuba policy. I'm attending the funeral of civil rights leader Dorothy Height and regret that I cannot be there in person. As you know, a constituent of mine, Alan Gross, was arrested and imprisoned without charge by the Cuban government on December 3rd, 2009. For the past 5 months, Mr. Gross has only been permitted to communicate with his family a handful of times. He is 60 years old and suffers from chronic physical ailments, and we are concerned about the conditions of his confinement. Additionally, his 86-year-old mother's health has begun to deteriorate in the wake of her son's incarceration. Mr. Gross visited Cuba as part of a USAID contract to help Cuba's Jewish community improve its ability to communicate with other Jews both in and outside of Cuba. He has worked on international development issues for over 25 years and has devoted his career to helping thousands of people around the world. Mr. Gross' incarceration is a matter of the greatest concern to the United States government, including members of Congress. Attached is a letter from a bipartisan group of members to the Cuban government calling for his immediate and unconditional release. The letter further states that Mr. Gross' arrest has caused many to doubt the Cuban government's expressed desire to improve relations with the United States. I welcome any suggestion of the witnesses, either on or off the record, as the best way to resolve this urgent matter. I appreciate your assistance and ask that this letter and the accompanying letter to the Cuban government be entered into the record. And without objection, we'll so do. I'm now pleased to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Brady, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you. I want to take this opportunity to publicly congratulate my friend and colleague, Mr. Tanner, on his becoming chairman of the Trade Subcommittee. I look forward to working with you in your new capacity. But today we're exploring the possibility of expanded trade with Cuba. I support sales of food and medicine to Cuba, as well as normal financing and travel arrangements to accommodate that. I suspect other members on the dais have different views, some willing to go farther, some unwilling to consider any liberalization whatsoever. Where I think we all agree, however, is that we must resolve the over $6 billion in expropriation claims that our Federal Settlement Claims Commission has certified before developing a more robust economic relationship with the post-Castro democratic government in Cuba. How these claims will be addressed is critical not only because it makes policy sense, but because it is the law. We're fortunate one of our witnesses today is a principal author of a USAID-funded report that analyzes the outstanding claims and proposes a mechanism for their resolution. I'm eagerly anticipating Professor Kelly's testimony. More broadly, however, I admit I'm frustrated to be talking about Cuba while we appear to be unable to have an open public discussion on exploring the possibility of expanding trade with democratic allies in the region, like Colombia. President Obama and Democratic leaders have argued the time is not right for the Colombia Trade Promotion Agreement because Colombia has not made enough progress on labor and human rights issues. They have said we need benchmarks, but here, after over a year in office, neither the administration nor the Congress, which has had even more time, has developed those benchmarks. I would welcome an opportunity to focus on them, against which Colombia's progress on stamping out violence will be measured. Well, let's look at the facts on the ground in both countries. International Labor Organization has reported on Cuba's labor policies. In fact, several test witnesses today will talk about that, and it is not pretty. Cuban labor law violates basic ILO principles with respect to the right to strike and bargain collectively, and Cuba has not even ratified the ILO Core Convention on the prohibition of the worst forms of child labor. By contrast, Colombia has ratified all 8 ILO core conventions. Moreover, the ILO recently commended Colombia for its progress in protecting labor rights. While U.S. trade policy should create incentives for countries to improve their policies, I worry about a possible double standard being promoted. That trade with Cuba could be fine, but trade with Colombia is a problem. I'm concerned about the geopolitical signals we send when we devote time and resources beyond food and medicine toward the consideration of overtures toward Chavez ally Cuba, while at the same time we continue to allow U.S. ally Colombia to twist in the wind. Many say that increased trade with Cuba makes sense because it represents a big market in our own backyard. It does. However, Cuba's economy is 1/4 that of Colombia's, as well as the population. Furthermore, the independent, nonpartisan U.S. International Trade Commission found the United States is already Cuba's most competitive ag supplier in terms of price, quality, and delivery of items. Finally, and this may actually be the most important point, at times it is hard not to question Cuba's interest in trading with us. Even in sectors in which America is allowed to trade, like agriculture, distortions abound as a result of the politically motivated import practices of Cuba's state trading enterprise. And although President Obama liberalized telecommunications trade with Cuba, our U.S. telecom companies haven't yet rushed in because, in their view, the costs and risks of dealing with the Cuban regime outweigh any marginal economic benefit. The economic climate in Cuba is in many ways intolerant. In fact, Cuba is ranked virtually dead last in the 2010 Index of Economic Freedom. And as our Secretary of State said earlier this month, the Castros, quote, do not want to see an end to the embargo, do not want to see normalization with the United States because they would lose all their excuses for what hasn't happened in Cuba over the last 50 years, unquote. So it looks to me like we may be flirting with an unwilling dance partner. If we're looking for new customers, it would seem to me that beyond food and agriculture in Cuba, that we should direct our attention to other bigger nearby markets with governments like Colombia that have extended themselves to us. That being said, Mr. Chairman, appreciate you calling this hearing today. I think this is going to be interesting testimony. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Brady, and without objection, all the members of this committee or those attending can insert their opening statements into the record at this time. Let me now move straight to the witnesses because we talk to each other all the time. We want to hear from y'all. We're pleased to have former Secretary of Agriculture under President Reagan, Mr. Block, who's a Senior Policy Advisor at Olson, Frank, and WIDA. Dr. Wayne Smith, the Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy and former Chief of U.S. Interest Sections in Havana. Jeff Thale, the Program Director of the Washington Office on Latin America, Mr. Jose Miguel Vivanco, Executive Director, Human Rights Watch, Americas Division, Mr. Myron Brilliant, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Senior Vice President for International Affairs, and Mr. Michael J. Kelly, J.D., Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Faculty Research and International Programs at Creighton University School of Law. Welcome to you all. Without objection, your entire statement will be inserted into the record. May I ask, in the interest of time, if you could hold your remarks to 5 minutes, and we would be pleased to receive any other extraneous material you wish to provide. May we now move straight to Mr. Secretary Block. Thank you, sir, for being here. You're recognized, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Tanner, Ranking Member Brady, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is John Block, and it is a privilege to testify before you here today. After graduating from the United States Military Academy at West Point, serving in the United States Army, I returned to our family farm in Knox County, Illinois, where I still produce hogs, corn, and soybeans, and we do have our corn planted this year. Last year, it was really late. Between 1981 and 85, I had the high honor of serving as President Reagan's Secretary of Agriculture. Since leaving government, I've enjoyed opportunities in the private and public sectors relating to agriculture, exports, nutrition, and food policy. I currently serve as a senior policy advisor at Olson Frankenweeda, but I am speaking to you today as a private citizen. I was in Cuba 10 years ago. I was there again last year, and I am convinced it's time to open Cuba to the United States for trade and travel. Ending our trade and travel embargoes against Cuba will be good for both the American people and the Cuban people. It'll be good for American agriculture, and most importantly, it will advance human rights and human liberty. I take a look back, and I remember vividly the first time President Reagan's cabinet met. That was at the Blair House. He had not been sworn in at that point. We were each asked to describe the priority issue for our department. I urged the President to take immediate action on his campaign promise to end the grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Secretary of State Alexander Haig, Defense Secretary Cap Weinberger, they vehemently disagreed. They told the President the grain embargo should only be lifted in exchange for concessions from the Soviets. But President Reagan, who had no love whatsoever what he called the godless communism, would not go back on his word to the American people or the American farmer. And within the first 100 days of his presidency, he unilaterally ended the grain embargo because he believed that selling grain to the Soviet Union was the right thing to do. It would benefit the American farmer and the Russian families. It would communicate to the Russian people that the United States of America was their friend, that the United States was committed to their nourishment and ultimately their liberty. Selling grain to the Soviet Union, like President Reagan's speech at the Berlin Wall, advanced the cause of freedom and contributed to the fall of the evil empire. President Obama should be opening trade and tourism with Cuba, just the way the President Reagan opened trade and tourism with the Soviet Union. Congress should pass the Peterson-Moran bill to help him do that. For 50 years, we have tried to use sanctions to force the Cuban people to get rid of communism, and our policy has totally failed. Over those 50 years, we fought a war in Vietnam. Now we have full diplomatic relations with Vietnam. We weren't friends with China at all. I was in China in the 70s, and we didn't even have an ambassador over there. Now we have full relations with China. And the list goes on, but somehow we cannot bring it to ourselves to open up trade and tourism and relationship with Cuba, 90 miles from our border. It doesn't make any sense. Congress needs to act immediately to restore the free flow of agricultural exports to Cuba. Under the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000, Cuba became a reliable customer for us, purchasing on average about $320 million in U.S. ag products each year. Many of those exports were specialized crops shipped in by smaller companies. In 2005, the Treasury Department contradicted the intent of Congress and required cash in advance of delivery instead of cash in advance of shipment. This introduced all kinds of havoc, I think most of you know. And since this change was instituted, all U.S. export trade with Cuba has had to be financed through foreign letters of credit routed through third country banks. And these restrictions have favored multinational companies that have the wherewithal to do a lot of this. And it excludes the small producers and processors and small businesses in the United States. These restrictions instituted by our own Treasury Department are actually trade sanctions directed against American farmers and ranchers. They have delivered the Cuban market into the arms of Brazilian, Canadian, Chinese, Vietnamese, and European competitors of ours. Congress provided temporary relief for these anti-agriculture sanctions in 2010. However, on October 1, that relief expires. Excuse me, and the American farmer will again be held hostage until this problem is solved permanently. And on the issue of travel, American people, just regular citizens, can travel anywhere in the world. We can go to Iraq, we can go to Afghanistan, we can go to Iran. And when years passed, I was in China in the 70s, but for some reason we can't travel to Cuba. It is just insane. A strong step towards changing these failed policies is represented by the Peterson-Moran legislation, H.R. 4645. Peterson-Moran legislation would narrow the competitive advantage enjoyed by our foreign competitors. The Peterson-Moran bill could increase farm exports by nearly $500 million and create more than 6,000 jobs in agriculture and related sectors. And by ending the travel ban, the bill would create thousands more jobs and more than $1 billion worth of additional economic activity. By building a relationship directly with the Cuban people, we will begin transforming Cuba into a friendly democracy. Just as President Reagan's actions with regard to the Russian grain embargo affirmed our faith and self-confidence in freedom and the strength of our system, we should act now with that conviction and that kind of confidence. These reforms are long overdue, and I urge this Congress to make them happen. That concludes my testimony. Final point, I have in my hand the testimony of Roger Johnson, the Farmers Union president, and I wholeheartedly agree with that, and it has been submitted to the committee. And thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions at your pleasure.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Your historical reflection is particularly welcome and constructive, I think. Dr. Smith, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir. I sympathize with that football coach who said if you call the same play 39 times, you're not going to win. I really feel that strongly because I've been involved in Cuban affairs for over 50 years now. I was in the U.S. Embassy when we broke relations. I served in the Cuba desk several times. I ended my diplomatic career in 1982, and I left the Foreign Service, seeing that we weren't going to change the plays at all. I left, and we haven't changed the plays. Now, let me say this. At a time when Cuba was the ally of our principal global adversary, the Soviet Union, at a time when Cuba was trying to overthrow other governments in the hemisphere, our policy made some sense. But that's long since passed. The Cold War has been over now for 20 years. Cuba is no longer trying to overthrow the other governments in the hemisphere. On the contrary, it now has normal diplomatic trade relations with them all. We are the only country in the hemisphere that doesn't have diplomatic and trade relations with Cuba. that really makes no sense at all. I thought the United States, I thought Americans were supposed to be flexible. They adjusted their policies accordingly. We haven't adjusted this policy at all. I said once that Cuba seems to have the same effect on American administrations that the full moon once had on werewolves. And, you know, that seems to be true, seems to have been true of every administration. We need to get away from this by beginning to lift, not beginning, by lifting travel controls. Let's allow Americans to travel to Cuba. Trade is another thing. We would have to lift embargo. That's a complicated matter, but we should be moving toward it. But the way to begin is by lifting travel controls. Clearly, that's what the American people want. The polls indicate the overwhelming majority of Americans believe we should be able to travel to Cuba. And I travel to Cuba frequently. I have a license, you see. I travel to Cuba, and I talk to, since I've been going down there for 50 years, I do have some friends left, and I talk to people on every trip. I can assure you that the overwhelming majority of Cubans also want Americans to be able to travel to Cuba. They want engagement with us and should have it. Now, again, every country, every Western Hemisphere country has normal diplomatic and trade relations with Cuba. Why can we not move? Why can we not move in that direction? This would not be simply doing a favor for Fidel Castro. It's doing a favor for us. It's allowing Americans to travel. If that's what the Cubans want, the more Americans who travel there, the more of our agricultural products the Cubans can buy. So in that sense also, it is in our interest. I simply see no compelling argument against. What do we lose by doing this? I would end by saying nothing.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Mr. Thale, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad the subcommittee is holding this hearing. I appreciate the opportunity to testify here before you about U.S. relations with Cuba. What I'd like to do is summarize my written testimony, make one general point about U.S. relations with Cuba, and then 3 specific points about U.S. relations with Cuba and their impact on our foreign policy more generally. The general point I'd like to make is that my organization focuses on human rights, on democracy, and social justice in Latin America, on the implications for U.S. policy of those issues. We've done so for more than 30 years. I think if you look at U.S. policy toward Cuba, what we see is that our current policy hurts our domestic political and economic interests, and it's doing nothing to improve the human rights situation on the island while hurting our foreign policy interests in Latin America. Secretary Block talked about, and I'm sure Mr. Brilliant and others will talk about, the economic possibilities we're losing in terms of trade with Cuba, in terms of helping our farmers and our exporters, in terms of helping the travel and tourism industry, at a time when we're trying to increase exports, at a time when we're trying to build jobs in this country. That's not something to be easily dismissed. On the flip side, as Jose Miguel and I'm sure others will point out, there's no question there are real and very serious human rights problems in Cuba itself. Political prisoners, restrictions on political freedom and freedom of expression, freedom of association. The difficulty is that while U.S. policy prevents us from taking advantage of the economic opportunities, it's done nothing to address the human rights problems. And I think in our view, like Mr. Block, the approach exemplified by the Trade Sanctions Reform Act, which looks for greater engagement with Cuba, both economically and politically, to affect the human rights situation, is the way we ought to be going. So that's the general point I'd like to make, that we ought to have a policy that benefits our economic interests and our foreign policy interests, and that our current Cuba policy doesn't do either. The 3 specific points. First, sanctions have failed to have much impact on the human rights situation in Cuba, and the flip side of that is that U.S. diplomats and the U.S. government have very little contact with the people in Cuba who might make a difference on human rights, on democracy, and on economic development issues in the future. Cuba's going through, or going to go through in the next decade, a generational change. forced by biological necessity. A new generation of leaders will come into Cuba, and very few of those people have had any systematic contact with U.S. government officials or with U.S. diplomats. I was in Cuba in January with a delegation that included some congressional staff. We met with a series of academics, of religious leaders, and of Cuban government officials. When we met with the U.S. interest section, they told us they envied our contact in Cuban society. And I think that's a real problem in terms of our ability to affect the future and influence those who might make decisions in Cuba. So I think from the point of view of influence in Cuba, we ought to be engaged. And I don't think there's something magical about that. I don't think our engagement will transform Cuba from today to tomorrow or lead Cuban leaders to join the League of Women Voters. But I think if we're standing on the sidelines, we're unable to exercise any influence at all, and it's in our interest to move in a new direction. So that's the second point. If we want to affect human rights, we ought to engage with the Cuban government and those who will affect its future. Secondly, our embargo on Cuba drives a wedge between us and other countries in Latin America. As Wayne noted, every country in the hemisphere has normal relations with Cuba. That includes Colombia. It includes a range of staunch U.S. allies. We're the only country here without those relations, and that causes difficulties for us with our allies. Most notably, last December, 32 of the 34 countries in the Western Hemisphere met in Cancun, Mexico. The president of Colombia was there. The president of Venezuela was there. People across the political spectrum. Cuba was there, and the United States was not. And that meeting ended with a call on the United States to end our embargo with Cuba. And I think if we're interested in strengthening our relations across the hemisphere, it's in our interest to do that. I think that's particularly true in the case of Brazil, a potential strategic partner for the United States, and one that's tried to engage with Cuba and has urged us to do the same. And the final point I'd like to make is that we have a series of national security interests in the Caribbean in particular, on drug policy, on drug interdiction, on organized crime, on migration, on human trafficking. We're in the midst of developing a Caribbean Regional Security Initiative and working with governments throughout the Caribbean on that issue. Cuba's a major player in the Caribbean. It's got diplomatic relations with everyone else. If we want to work on those kind of issues, we ought to be at least engaged with Cuba on issues where national security matters. So just to wrap up, I think it's pretty clear our current policy fails to make a difference while hurting us economically, and in particular, it hurts our national security interests, it hurts our relations with our allies, and it hurts our ability to influence events in Cuba. So on all those grounds, I'd urge us to look for a new direction in our Cuba policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vivanco, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Brady, members of the subcommittee. I am honored to appear before you today to participate in this timely and critically important hearing regarding U.S. restrictions on travel to and trade with Cuba. Human Rights Watch has been reporting on the human rights situation in Cuba for more than 2 decades. Cuba remains the one country in this hemisphere that systematically represses virtually all forms of political dissent. In July 2006, Fidel Castro handed over control of the Cuban government to his brother Raul Castro. Rather than dismantle Cuba's repressive machinery, Raul Castro has kept it firmly in place and fully active. Scores of political prisoners arrested under Fidel Castro continue to languish in Cuban prisons, and Raul Castro's government has used draconian laws and sham trials to incarcerate scores more. The Cuban government has relied in particular on a dangerous provision in the criminal code that allows the state to imprison individuals before they have committed a crime on the suspicion that they might commit an offense in the future. This Orwellian law captures the essence of the Cuban government's repressive mindset, which views anyone who acts out of step with the government as a potential threat and thus worthy of punishment. Human rights defenders, journalists, and other civil society members are persecuted with systematic due process violations, including abusive interrogations without legal counsel. Political prisoners are subjected to widespread abuses, including forced ideological re-education, prolonged solitary confinement, and the denial of medical treatment for serious illness. If efforts by the U.S. government to press for change in Cuba by imposing a sweeping ban on trade and travel have proven to be a costly and misguided failure. The embargo imposes indiscriminate hardship on the Cuban population as a whole. And as the research of Human Rights Watch shows, it has done nothing to improve the situation of human rights in Cuba. Rather than isolating Cuba, the policy has isolated the United States, enabling the Castro government to garner sympathy abroad while simultaneously alienating Washington's potential allies. There is no question the Cuban government bears full and exclusive responsibility for the abuses it commits. However, so long as the embargo remains in place, the Castro government will continue to manipulate U.S. policy to cast itself as a Latin American David standing up to a U.S. Goliath. Ending the travel ban and removing obstacles to agricultural trade are steps in the right direction toward reforming this ineffective policy. Therefore, we fully support the Travel Restriction Reform and Export Enhancement Act. We believe the proposed legislation represents the most comprehensive effort to date to overhaul a U.S. policy that has failed for decades to have any impact on improving human rights in Cuba. Nonetheless, Human Rights Watch does not believe that the legislation lifting the travel ban and removing obstacles to agricultural trade with Cuba will, by itself, bring an end to repression by the Cuban government. Such an expectation is unrealistic. Even in the face of such a significant shift in U.S. policy, we should expect the Cuban government to continue to deny its people their fundamental freedoms. However, that is not a justification for keeping a failed policy in place. Rather, the United States should replace its unilateral approach focused on regime change with a multilateral approach focused on human rights. This move would fundamentally shift the balance in the Cuban government's relationship with its own people and the international community, and will place more effective pressure on the Castro government. No longer would Cuba be able to manipulate the embargo as a pretext for its repression or an excuse for its problems. Nor would other countries be able to blame the U.S. policy for their own failures to hold Cuba accountable for its abuses. In sum, nothing will be more threatening to the Castro's half-century monopoly on power than a coalition of countries, including the United States, adopting a shared strategy focused on promoting human rights in Cuba. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before you today. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Brilliant, welcome. You have the floor.
Chairman Tanner, Ranking Member Brady, and members of the Subcommittee on Trade, thank you for inviting the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to testify today at this hearing on U.S. policy towards Cuba. My name is Myron Brilliant. It's actually one of the few times I've been before a committee that no one has commented on that last name. But I am Senior Vice President for International Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's always a pleasure to be before this important committee. I want to make 3 points here today. First, our ultimate goal is a complete lifting of the embargo of Cuba. This is a long-standing policy of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Second, we know it's going to take some time. It won't happen overnight. However, we do think it's important to take incremental steps such as those proposed by Congressman Peterson and Moran in H.R. 4645, which would be good for America's economy and, most importantly, great for America's values. And point 3, we believe Congress and the administration have to work together to provide the political space for real reform and must move on H.R. 4645. We urge you to do so. I'd like to take the rest of my time to describe the rationale for the Chamber's position. Getting U.S. Cuba policy right matters. It matters first because our response will send a signal to the wider world about American values and how we help neighbors who have suffered oppression and poverty under a dictator. From the business community's viewpoint, U.S. policy toward Cuba is out of date and ineffective, a hangover from the Cold War. The reality is that unilateral sanctions do not work. The last 50 years of our embargo against Cuba have proven that. Rather than encouraging Cuba to democratize, the embargo has made a martyr out of a dictator and actually helped prop up the communist regime. No one seriously argues that the Cuban dictatorship could have withstood 5 decades of free trade, free markets, and free enterprise, powered by its own entrepreneurial citizens. It's on the basis of these values, these core American values, that we support closer economic engagement with Cuba. We are convinced that we need a different approach. In our view, additional commercial and people-to-people contacts would facilitate a transition to a more open society and an economy providing greater freedom and opportunity for the Cuban people. Prior to the embargo, the United States accounted for nearly 70% of Cuba's international trade. Cuba was the 7th largest market for U.S. exporters, particularly important for America's farm producers. The embargo forced Cuba to seek out new sources for its domestic consumption. American farmers, businesses, and workers are therefore missing significant economic opportunities that are eagerly being taken up by others, including our trading partners, as others have mentioned. In 2000, the embargo was partly eased by the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act. The act permits the sale of agricultural exports with a variety of restrictions and licensing requirements, including cash and advance payments via third-country banks. Despite this heavy regulation, U.S. exports to Cuba rose from less than 1 million to 392 million in 2004. And U.S. agricultural products captured 42% of the Cuban market. In 2005, the Bush administration tightened payment terms even further, and as a result, U.S. agricultural sales to the island decreased by nearly 15% in the following 2 years. As Secretary Block and others have mentioned, given the restrictions, the majority of current agricultural trade with Cuba is done by multinational companies, as small and medium-sized enterprises are deterred by the complexity of the regulations. Removing restrictions on trade with Cuba would help SMEs by giving them access to a much-needed market in these difficult times. Easing restrictions on already legal trade is not enough, however. Lifting the travel ban is vital and will create jobs in the U.S. It will have an impact on direct investment in tourism, infrastructure such as hotels, shops, and cruise ship ports for Cuba. It could help thousands of Cubans to improve their standard of living and their economic independence from the state, a goal we should all share. Cuba's hospitality sector pays significantly higher wages than other sectors. Growth in the job market, higher wages, increased access to hard currency for the Cuban people in the form of tips and direct payments from tourists will improve the quality of life of many Cubans. And additionally, Cuba's small entrepreneurs, artists, taxi drivers, family restaurants, and people who rent rooms in their homes will benefit from the influx of American visitors. So lifting the travel ban is a necessity. It will not only help the Cuban people, it will help the American people to serve as ambassadors of democracy and freedom, and American businesses to spread the values of entrepreneurship and free enterprise. In the interest of time, I will not cover all the details of H.R. 465, but I will mention that there have been studies, including by Texas A&M University, that shows that if we did pass that act, that we could increase up to $365 million in annual sales of U.S. goods, and that could have a total economic impact of $1.1 billion and create 6,000 new jobs in the United States. Cuba's poverty is the direct result of a half-century of Marxist mismanagement. The embargo allows the regime to blame it on Washington. It's time to eliminate this pretext for the Cuban government's resistance to positive change. As the administration seeks new initiatives to increase U.S. exports, taking even the simplest steps available, such as improving pending free trade agreements and easing the terms for agricultural sales to Cuba, represent a no-cost measure that will help create hundreds of thousands of American jobs. Business executives understand that real change is often incremental, as with these proposals. Yet commerce has the power to transform societies. The best path forward would be to lift the embargo, but measures taken in that direction are well worth taking, and we urge the Congress and administration to act now. Once again, I appreciate the opportunity to testify and welcome the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Kelly, you're recognized, sir.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Brady, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today regarding U.S. Cuba policy. Having traveled from Nebraska to be here this morning, I was happy to hear you invoke the wisdom of Coach Osborne. We were happy to lend him to you for a few years, and we're equally happy to have him back. This is an important concern for everyone on both sides of the strait for generations to come. The Cuban-American bilateral relationship, which has remained at an impasse since 1959, is now at a crossroads. Normalizing relations between our two countries is a goal that we all share, but the path to achieving that goal remains in some dispute. On behalf of the academic team that studied the property claims issue with respect to Cuba, we would counsel against immediately and unconditionally lifting the embargo without first addressing the property claims that U.S. citizens have against the Cuban government, stemming from the first nationalization actions of Fidel Castro in 1959. To do so would be to invite the nationalization of other U.S. assets by other regimes if they perceive that the U.S. government is not willing to legally fight for the rights of its citizens abroad. Creighton University was awarded a grant, as Mr. Brady indicated, from the federal government to study the property claims issue, and we developed two models to provide a template to be used by the U.S. government in future negotiations with a democratic regime in Havana, if that happens. Our report proposes a dual-track property claim settlement mechanism. The first track is a bilateral Cuba-U.S. tribunal established by treaty or executive agreement between a new Cuban government and the U.S. The jurisdiction of the tribunal would be over property claims of U.S. nationals which have been certified by the Federal Claims Settlement Commission. The second track is a Cuban Special Claims Court constituted as an independent chamber of the Cuban national judiciary. The jurisdiction of this special court would be over property claims from the Cuban-American exile community. The first group of property claims are held by U.S. national claimants. These are American individuals and corporations who were Americans at the time of the unlawful expropriation, mostly 1959 and 1960. They've certified their claims, and international law generally recognizes the right of American claimants to be compensated. These would be resolved in the model bilateral tribunal that we've proposed that's modeled loosely on the U.S.-Iran Claims Tribunal. The point being here, I suppose, centrally that if we can resolve property claims with Iran, then we can certainly resolve property claims with Cuba. The second group of property claims is held by Cuban-American exiles. Members of this group were Cuban at the time of the expropriation of their property, and thus are not protected under U.S. law to the same extent as the U.S. national claimants. Because members of this claimant group were nationals of Cuba when their property was expropriated, international law generally does not recognize a right of recovery. Jurisdiction, therefore, over these claims would reside within the Cuban judiciary and would be resolved by the second model we've developed, a Cuban Special Claims Court that would be constructed fairly and equitably to hear these claims. The model for property claims settlement between Cuba and the United States that we devised is one in which the short-term interests of the claimants are addressed simultaneously with the long-term interests of normalized Cuba-U.S. relations, stabilized post-embargo circumstances in Cuba, sustainable foreign investment in the Cuban economy, and direct and indirect benefit to the Cuban people. Moreover, the interests of all claimant classes are addressed in furtherance of decreasing cross-strait turmoil and mending Cuban-American-Cuban relations. Additionally, property interests of claimant parties are recognized and addressed with compensatory, restitution, and mediated investment awards, while the property interests of innocent third parties in Cuba are also recognized and protected. Nobody on the island will be turned out of their homes, yet nobody with a verifiable claim of property confiscation will come away empty-handed. The twin goals of maximizing the pool of stakeholders likely to opt into this process while minimizing a disruptive effect during Cuba's post-Castro, hopefully, transition, eliminating the property issue, boosting foreign investment and benefiting the people of Cuba have been met by this model if it is adopted. Creighton University is ready to assist the U.S. government in furtherance of these objectives when the transition occurs or when Congress and the President decide to act. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly, and thank all of you for a most enlightening presentation. This hearing hopefully will be constructive as we continue to debate the Peterson-Moran bill. And you answered a lot of the questions that I had in your testimony about that, but if I may ask Ms. Secretary, some of the critics of this hearing today suggest that lifting the travel ban would just benefit the Cuban elite and would basically prop up, if you could, the Castro regime. I don't share that point of view, but could you elaborate on that? I think you alluded to it in your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listen, the embargo we've had in place, it's just unilateral, it's just us. It hasn't brought the regime down anyway. I mean, it hasn't destroyed them. It's not going to destroy them. And having travel there actually, frankly, would help their economy in some respects, but then they'll buy more products from us, trade will increase, and the exchange of people is one way to improve relations. And as the other individuals that have testified here today, we've got to have some interaction with them. We're not going to fix this thing the way we've been doing it for 50 years. And so I just don't buy that concern. I mean, they can say it, but it's not, doesn't sell with me.
Anyone else care to comment, Dr. Smith?
Well, the Cuban people certainly wouldn't agree with that. The Cuban people want engagement. They want Americans to be able to travel down there. They don't see it in terms of this will benefit only the government. They see it in terms of benefiting everybody. Thank you.
Mr. Brilliant.
Yeah, if I could just briefly say, it's not often that this committee has a chance to hear the views of this collection of individuals, but you know, if I were to tell you that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the AFL-CIO, the Human Rights Group, the U.S. Chamber are all aligned to tell you that ending the travel ban will help, not hurt, the cause of freedom in Cuba, that should tell you something powerful right there.
Thank you. Mr. Brady, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman. I think this is very important to have this. I appreciate your leadership and excellent testimony. I wish Catholics, bishops, AFL-CIO, and the Chamber would unite behind the Colombia Free Trade Agreement. And that's perhaps one of my concerns is that great arguments today, and the point that was made that if we maximize ag and food sales and normalize our business relationship in those areas, that we could create, you know, generate some $300, maybe $500 million in new export sales, 6,000 new jobs is excellent. But I look at Colombia, Panama, and South Korea, we're looking at $13 billion of American sales to those countries, you know, 250,000 new jobs, you know, dramatically larger market, bigger economic impact. I look at the labor and human rights violations in Cuba, and labor especially, where you know, you can only join state-sanctioned affiliated unions. You're imprisoned if you try to do otherwise. There's no right to strike. You can't do collective bargaining. Colombia, on the other hand, does all of that. In fact, ILO is parked in Colombia, telling us daily about the progress there. We see, as Mr. Vivanco said, that Raul Castro has not dismantled the regime. In fact, has activated it and continues to imprison political foes. Colombia has a remarkable record in that area, and I can't help but think, having waited so long to get health care over, looking at how we can find new customers throughout the world, beyond maximizing our ag and medicine sales and normalizing that business relationship, should Cuba be our highest trade priority? I don't believe it is. But to Mr. Kelly, the point, as we look at this, we know our law requires us to deal with the expropriations claims. Mr. Kelly talked about that in his testimony. You note if the United States walks away from forcefully asserting the claims of U.S. nationals, it signals green light to other regimes that the U.S. accepts the confiscation of U.S. assets in their countries as well. We held a hearing on this. This is a topic of importance to Republicans and Democrats alike. Could you expand on that point? What other countries in the region might be looking at that signal and making decisions on their own that it may be okay to expropriate our U.S. Property in those countries?
Well, thank you, Mr. Brady. I don't think it's just other countries in the region. I think we have to think globally. Certainly, there are other countries in the region, like Venezuela has had multiple nationalizations that have occurred over the period of the last 3 years. We currently have, according to the U.S. Trade Representative, $10 billion invested, directly invested in Venezuela, primarily in manufacturing, non-bank holding companies and mining sectors. We look at Nicaragua with the return of Daniel Ortega. He's playing nice with us now, but who knows, what he might do in the future. We have $203 million invested there. We look at Bolivia with Evo Morales, who also is going down the same road as Hugo Chavez. We have $262 million invested in Bolivia. We look at Ecuador, which has been a topic of great interest lately with the professed nationalization strategy that President Rafael Correa has laid out for taking over the oil industry. He already has defaulted on $3.2 billion in debt. And we have overall $2.4 trillion, according to the Congressional Research Service, invested abroad. I don't think we want to put that money and those investments in jeopardy by telegraphing to the rest of the world that we're not going to stand up for the property rights of American companies and citizens, even if those property rights are 60 years old. Or it's the principle of the thing, I think, that we need to stand up for.
And what's the mix of those rights versus individuals versus corporations?
It varies from country to country.
But I mean, in Cuba itself.
In Cuba itself, if you look at our report, it's about a 75-25 split, individuals versus companies. And because those claims are so old, what's interesting is that through mergers and acquisitions and deaths and inheritance, the current claim holders might not be the same people that were the original claim holders. I think one of the largest claim holders today through mergers and acquisitions is a company called OfficeMax, which didn't exist in 1959.
Thank you. So your point is property is still, takings are still property takings, yes. 6 years old or not, and because we have a number of risk in other countries that are having problems with this today, it's important that we, one, follow the law, send the right signal. Is that correct?
Sure, exactly.
Great. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm over my time. Again, thank you for holding this hearing. This is a great discussion on an important topic.
Thank you, Mr. Brady. I would just point out we're not talking about lifting the embargo. We're talking about loosening trade and travel restrictions. Mr. Neal, Chair is pleased to recognize.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I, too, want to applaud your leadership in holding this hearing. For Dr. Smith and then for Mr. Vivanco, where are the Cuban people? I've had a chance to visit with the Pope some years ago, and we were encouraged to have sort of free interchanges with the Cuban people. But where are they today? I mean, despite the fact that there's an authoritarian regime that still runs the country, are they, Dr. Smith, would you say that they're more inclined to, through the internet and other, I think, tools of democratization, to start to see things a little bit differently? They have pretty stark lives. That's my point.
I think the Cuban people are very balanced. I think they tend to support the government, but on the other hand, they want change. There's no question of that. They do want change. They certainly favor engagement with the United States, I think they see it in a very sophisticated way. I think they see it as a means of bringing about, slowly perhaps, but bringing about change. Look, Cuba is not a democracy, no. But on the other hand, it's it's not sort of a slave labor camp. Cubans tend to be fairly content. They have a good public health system. They have a good educational system. By and large, they have enough to eat, a place to live. So it's not that they're living in misery, but they do want change. Cubans are very smart, and they do understand that this system they have now is probably not the best way to bring about a better economic life. So they want change, but they don't want any violence. They don't want confrontation at all.
Okay. Mr. Babanko?
I'm not sure that I can answer your question, but in terms of what is the position of the Cuban people?
I'm trying to take a flavor of what the Cuban people might think about. I mean, look, the trends of democratization across the globe, you can't easily dismiss them. In the far corners of just the time that I've been in this House, what's happened across the earth is extraordinary in terms of the trends of democratization everywhere. And much of it has to do with an easier access to information, for sure. People see the benefits of trade, and they have an opportunity, I think, with the internet to kind of see what the rest of the world is doing and how the rest of the world is living. And the Cuban people must, given, I think, Dr. Smith's accurate description of them as visionary and intelligent people, what is their take? I mean, what's happened in Latin America is extraordinary in and of itself over the time that we've been in this House.
Politically speaking, I think that they're still very much isolated from the rest of the world. According to the information that we have, internet is not having a great deal of impact in Cuba. Why? Because it's strictly controlled by the government. It's difficult to have access. Therefore, those bloggers, for instance, who keep producing information about what is going on in the country, most of them are very well known outside Cuba, but not inside Cuba. It's costly, it's difficult, and they live essentially under fear, facing a machinery of repression that is extremely effective and could use mechanisms of prevent any type of dissent, or demonstration or protest against the government.
Okay. Mr. Brilliant, I have just a couple of seconds left. Do you want to take a shot at this?
Well, if I were to take a shot, it would be from a slightly different perspective.
That's what we'd like to.
Polling.
That's why you're here.
Yeah, I would look at it from the standpoint of what are attitudes of Cubans in exile, and that is certainly changing. And polling that has been done, including in Miami, suggests that more and more Cubans in exile want to see an easing of the restrictions, both on trade and travel. And so our perspective would be based on that finding less than what's going on the ground, because we don't have as much knowledge there.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Davis from Kentucky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you bringing this critical issue to the fore. I'd like to point out first, my issue is not with the Cuban people, but with the Cuban government. I'd be very willing to achieve a significant détente with Cuba if we address the issues properly. But for all the wonderful perspective that's being shared, I'd like to just echo Mr. Brady's comments that relate to the subcommittee's priorities. I question we're expending valuable time and resources exploring the possibility of increased trade and engagement with communist Cuba, whose military, I might add, participated in direct operations and activities against United States personnel in Vietnam, in the African Civil Wars, in Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Grenada, working in comport with the Venezuelan government right now, is trying to subvert the Colombian government, who's been a staunch ally with us for over 25 years, and bring down the democratic countries in Latin America. We're seeing this both on the national security side and on the economic side and through their work with the labor movement. And Colombia is forced to sit by and watch us deal with somebody who's openly been our adversary from a governmental standpoint for economic gain. And I'm not saying this as a pejorative towards the Cuban people, but it leads us to some other issues of redress that I think are legitimate, and we have to deal with this as a business issue, as business partners would if we're going to tackle it, with some ethical consistency, I believe. But also, let's look at the claims issue for a moment. They can be tricky. Intellectual property rights are critical, and I think the story of Cuban cigars, a well-known brand, is very germane to this. My understanding is that one company that sells a Punch brand cigar in the United States, made from Dominican Republic tobacco, another totally separate company, 50% owned by the Cuban government, which I might add is a dictatorship that's a totalitarian state that has been an enemy of the United States in its both its internal propaganda and operations, has shared profits from this. The trademarks and marketing of these cigars are identical, whether they're sold in the United States or whether they're sold outside our borders. What difference is the tobacco that's in the inside? How can this be? Well, in 1960, the Cuban government stole the land, the factories, the intellectual property, and is still profiting from that over 50 years later. And the notion that we would freely open our markets up is unprecedented, to the earlier point that's made from other companies, like Venezuela, I might add, that's working against our interests, openly stating that to their people, and now we want to open the doors. I think it creates a distortion in the commercial market that doesn't make sense to me. And Professor Kelly, I guess my question to you is, could the mechanism proposed in your study address these issues? Now, the United States establishing business agreements has in fact solved these problems with former adversaries in the past. But they've also come to equitable agreement on these very issues. We've done it time after time after time. But wouldn't it be better to address that now and talk about those mechanisms as opposed to just swing the door open?
Yes, Mr. Davis, I totally agree. I think that all of the embargo and trade issues have to be addressed in a package deal with the property claims issue. They need to be addressed in tandem. And to specifically answer your question on dealing with the Castro regime, that goes to the quality of the government you're willing to deal with. The Libertad Act currently requires that we don't deal with them until a certain long list of criteria are met for a democratic transition for a new government. So even to begin talking with them, we're talking about some legislative adjustments that would have to be undertaken. And like I said earlier, protecting property rights is paramount in the minds of the American business community, but this is also the community who wants to invest in Cuba. So there's some twin goals operating here. Long-term and worldwide, they want to see that America is willing to stand up for their investments abroad, but they also don't want to see European and third countries come in and take the opportunities, the business opportunities that might be coming up in Cuba. Raul Castro has offered to enter into discussions with us, and I don't know exactly where the Obama administration is on that. But I think until the Congress and the President can come to some accord on how or whether we're going to engage, he's not going to be able to go forward. And going back to Mr. Brady's point on Colombia, it's fine to have human rights benchmarks in place before you deal with a country. That's great. But there's other questions associated with that. Not only what are the benchmarks, but second of all, are they universally applicable to every country? Every country has to meet the same human rights benchmarks, or are they tailored to each country? And if that's the case, are we going to hold China accountable to the human rights benchmarks?
Well, I think that's my point related to Venezuela as well. And I might add that cigar company that is owned by the Cuban government is owned by the Cuban military, actually, which, we are dealing with similar situations in China right now, but again, under different business terms. Mr. Brilliant, you suggested you'd like to share something.
Well, I think your question and your premise we agree with, which is American values and Americans' credibility is at stake in the region. And we do not want Venezuela to continue to have the say they do in the Americas. And we're very concerned about a drift. And so, of course, we want to see our policy towards Cuba go forward, and we want to see the approval of the Colombia Free Trade Agreement. But it's also important to move forward with Cuba as well, because, again, we shouldn't be looking at it. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can manage to move forward with the trade agreements, and we can manage to move forward with Cuba under the same premise. We want to make sure that America's values, America's standing in our own backyard is at the front of everyone's attention.
Just in summary then, so it's just a kind of a yes or no. So you're saying basically that you'd like to see, A, the same standard applied to Cuba that's applied to Colombia, and B, not open the door to Cuba until they're coming up in that direction?
No, I said we want to see the approval of the Colombia Free Trade Agreement because it's important, but we also want to see advancement in our relationship with Cuba.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the extra time.
Mr. Etheridge, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Block, thank you for being here, and all the rest of you. We appreciate you taking time today, and thank you for your service to our nation as Secretary and as a member of the farming community. Let me bring this back to a little more local, to North Carolina, where we do quite a bit of farming in a host of areas, as we're talking about job creation and other stuff. And as you probably know, Mr. Secretary, North Carolina is a major pork-producing state, as well as poultry and a host of others. And right now, Cuba is one of the major markets. I might be surprised at some of the folks here this morning. Even in the current obstacles to put up in dealing with trade and going through third parties, I am told that it's the 9th largest market for some of those products from North Carolina. In 2008, we sold more than 30 million pounds of poultry and more than 28 million pounds of pork. These are numbers we got from the state. And that's not just a lot of Cuban sandwiches. That's more than $30 million in revenue for North Carolina farmers, and especially in a down economy, that means jobs. So my question, Mr. Secretary, is what kind of immediate increase do you think a state like North Carolina or other states might benefit from under the Peterson bill? Because this is really what we're talking about.
But I don't think that I could tell you precisely state by state. I know I couldn't do that. But the International Trade Commission proposes that our trade with Cuba would ramp up to perhaps over $1 billion a year. And as close as your state is, you're going to benefit more than a lot of others. And as we well know, your state produces a lot of products that are exactly what they need. They need pork. They need grain. And you can do that. When I was there last year, I mean, it was common knowledge that they're importing 60, 70% of their food. I mean, it's not a surprise. They're farming with oxen. I mean, they are so far behind us in agriculture. It's a big market, and we just, I hear all this talk about, well, we can't do it because the Cubans are making trouble for us in this country or that country, and they're not doing good things for us. There are countries all over the world that we have normal relationships with. We trade with them. We don't even like them very much. But at the same time, we do business with them, and we travel all the time. I mean, I was in the Soviet Union in the 70s, and before I was Secretary of Agriculture, and you know the problems we had with the Soviet Union, but we traded with them. Earl Butz made the big grain sale to the Soviet Union, and we travel there freely. We can't travel to Cuba, and they're putting all kinds of roadblocks in our trade, and then there's all these excuses why we can't do it. And the excuses really don't hold up anymore, given the fact that this policy we've had for 50 years has just not worked.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I was there 2 years ago, and I think you're right on. And for folks who argue that, we're trading with China, and we did that long before we got, anyway. Let me ask a question here to Mr. Thale and Mr. Vencio, because I think this is one that brings a little bit narrower focus to it. Travel restrictions is not the only part of the embargo that the United States imposes on Cuba. We did that almost 50 years ago. And one tragic feature of that embargo is one that a lot of folks don't think about. And I got a call just this past week, so this meeting is pretty important this morning, and I call attention to this. Because we've been blocking pension payments to retired Cuban pastors and teachers who were members of the U.S. Protestant denominations before the Revolution. They didn't do anything wrong. Some $800,000 is now owed to those former, and I'm going to just talk about one denomination because it's the only one I have. The Protestant group of the Presbyterians, of clergymen and their spouses and families. This just doesn't seem right to me for people who haven't done anything wrong. They ministered to the people there. They serve their God and their people. They've earned these pensions. And when Cuban-American relationships were good, they did the right thing. And I'm sure there are many other small stories of unintended consequences of this embargo. But this is a troubling one. The money is sitting in U.S. banks, but they can't get to these elderly people who are dying. And if travel restrictions were relaxed, do you think the Cuban government would help facilitate these payments? And I'd be interested in your thoughts because you touched on it, and this seems to be an area both of you have some knowledge in.
Thank you, Mr. Etheridge. 2 points. One, the general point, I think you've underscored that in addition to the travel restrictions, there are a number of other restrictions in the embargo, and that some of them are really major ones that have to do with sales from Cuba to the United States and so on. Some of them are very small and very specialized kind of things like those you highlighted, and they matter a lot to individuals. I met a choir director, a Presbyterian choir director, as a matter of fact, who moved to Cuba in the mid-1950s, and in the early 2000s was still there, still leading the choir in her church, and was in exactly that same situation. My impression is that Spaniards who retire to Cuba, for example, are able to receive their pensions there. Other Europeans who retire. So my impression is that if we were able to make that possible, the Cuban government would be willing to do so as well, and that would, for a very special group of people, make a tremendously important difference, yes.
You want to comment? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Etheridge. Mr. Reichert, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to add my thanks for holding this hearing. I do think it is critical that we begin to address our business relationships, trade relationships with other countries across this world. It's critical. We're in a global economy. We need to recognize that, and we need to be doing business with countries around the world. It means jobs here. I'm from Washington State, and so we have 1 out of every 3 jobs in Washington State is directly related to trade. Korea, of course, is one of our major trade partners. They're our 4th largest trade partner for Washington State. So, you know, as I listen to this discussion, it's really, it's very, very interesting to hear the issues made about national security, the economic development, the cultural exchanges, the educational opportunities, the increase in quality of life, the availability of health care, for instance, in some of these countries that may be even lacking far behind most nations in the world. All of that is, I think, achievable through trade relations, through creating those partnerships. But it seems like, and we talk about jobs, and the figure of 6,000 jobs was mentioned by a couple of the members of the panel. I know that the Chamber of Commerce has mentioned that, you know, as we look at Korea, the trade agreement there, we're losing 380,000 jobs as Canada and the EU begin their discussions and make their agreements with their trade, with their trade agreements that they're looking at with Korea, and here we sit. So 6,000 jobs, 380,000 jobs. We have an agreement with Korea and Colombia and Panama. I do agree that we can be multitasking and we should move ahead and looking at Cuba and our relationship with them and opening that relationship up. But what about Korea, Panama, and Colombia? What I find very interesting, too, is the mention of the AFL-CIO. And here's where I want to go with this. The President, first of all, he says, I want to open up, I want to double our exports. But he doesn't give a time frame for that. The last time we doubled our exports was between 1995 and 2007, and we passed 9 trade agreements. And that's where we really need to begin to look with Cuba and these other countries. My question is, really, we need your help, because the AFL-CIO being on board with opening up relations with Cuba surprises me pleasantly. How do we get the unions because they're so afraid of the rumor or the perception, I should say, that jobs are lost when trade increases. And I think that is, when you talk about excuses, sometimes unions use the excuses of human atrocities occurring in Colombia. There's not safety for the union members, and we all know the improvements that Colombia has made. So how can we convince members of the unions across this nation that these trade agreements are indeed critical to job creation in the United States and critical to the success of the global economy, and that America lead the way? And Mr. Brilliant, please go first.
Well, first of all, in terms of economic impact, getting the 3 free trade agreements done and approved is the best way to create jobs in our country, and that would be with South Korea, Panama, and Colombia. And you referenced our trade study, which shows if we don't get these deals done, we'll lose jobs. The EU will be signing free trade agreements with both Colombia and with South Korea this month, and so it's absolutely critical that the Congress move forward with those FTAs. It is a shame that we don't have the unions behind this, because the longshoremen and others who move trade every day as part of their work would benefit from these free trade agreements. And we're going to have first of all, 50 million Americans are employed directly in companies that are exporting abroad. So American jobs are tied to increasing exports. And you know, we called for the doubling of U.S. exports before the President did in the State of the Union. But the bottom line is we need action, and the FTAs are part of that. But why we're here today on Cuba is it's also about our credibility as well. And we need to advance ways to ensure that there's freedom and openness in that society as well. In terms of economic impact, though, the FTAs are our priority, and I should be clear on that.
I see my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again for holding this hearing. I look forward to others. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rockert. Let me say that all of these other trade matters are of importance to this subcommittee. The focus today on Cuba is in connection with the moving of the Peterson-Moran bill because we have some jurisdiction in this regard. But rest assured, we want to look at, this subcommittee wants to look at all of the others that are in the interest of American business and job creation. Ms. Sanchez, Chair, please recognize you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the hearing today. Albert Einstein once said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And it strikes me that that pretty much applies to what our policy has been towards Cuba and trade. Mr. Kelly, I want to start with you. In your written testimony, you note that you state that, and I'm quoting you here, the embargo is widely seen as the key point of pressure to move the Cuban government into negotiations over the property issues. Some of the other witnesses disagree and seem to believe that the embargo has had no appreciable effect. In 50 years, has our policy resulted in any property being returned to folks? Or can you describe for me any successes the U.S. has had with applying this particular type of pressure? Because it seems to me you haven't made a whole lot of headway in 50 years. Am I correct?
In a word, yes.
Thank you.
But I think that part of the broader point was that the property claims issue needs to be a package deal with the embargo issue. I was talking to Dr. Smith before the hearings today, and his experience with the State Department back in the 1970s bore this out. In fact, they began talking about settling the property issue in conjunction with the embargo. The Angola matter threw that off the table. But one of the things that Mr. Reichart raised, and Dimick in his question, I think, to Mr. Brilliant, was the transformative power of opening trade. Presidents of both parties have adopted this philosophy. You may recall President Reagan resisted, really tough sanctions on apartheid South Africa, thinking that, and it turned out to be true, that you could transform the regime from within if you engage it. President Clinton made the same argument with respect to China. And I hear the tinges of that today with respect to Cuba. But in those issues, there weren't property claims confiscation.
I understand that, but my point was basically that in the 50 years we've had this policy in place, we really haven't seen any movement on the property issue, and I don't expect that if we continue with the same course of action, we are going to see any movement on that. Mr. Thale, in your written testimony, you said that the U.S. Cuba policy has serious repercussions in Latin America, and I agree with that. And I want to explore this a little bit more with you because I've traveled to Latin America many, many times. I used to serve on the Foreign Relations Committee. In talking with the working men and women in many of these Latin American countries, there is, and I've heard this over and over again, sort of they give me these first-hand account of this kind of mistrust of the United States and its policies. And when I discuss our image problems abroad, particularly with respect to Latin America, among my colleagues here in Congress, some of them just seem to be shocked and unable to understand why Latin American workers would mistrust the United States. It's almost like they think, because of Hugo Chavez, that Latin America woke up one day and decided to hate the United States. Can you please explain some of the repercussions that you referred to in your testimony with respect to our relations with Latin America?
Sure. Thank you for that question. A couple of points to make. One is that at the level of governments, I think every country in the region has normal relations with Cuba. All of them have called on us to have normal relations with Cuba. And very few of them understand why we don't in terms of foreign policy interests. So I think there's that. I think the other, which you underscore, is at the level of ordinary people on the street living their daily lives and their perception of the United States. There's been a long history in U.S. relations with the region of heavy-handedness. President Obama announced last year that we wanted to move away from that we wanted to move toward greater partnership with people in the region. I think there's a lot of hope in Latin America that President Obama would follow on that, and one of the things that people in the region see as an easy symbol for that is changing our relationship with Cuba. I think a lot of people on the street in the region aren't foreign policy specialists or human rights specialists, but they don't understand why we haven't done this, and changing it would to them signal that we're moving into a more common sense relationship with the region.
Thank you. I have very little time, but I want to try to squeeze in one last question for Dr. Smith. In your testimony, you contrast the U.S. travel policy to Russia and Vietnam with our travel policy to Cuba. Did the different policies ever make sense, and if not, why do they remain in place?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Sure. In your written testimony, you contrast U.S. travel policy to Russia and Vietnam with our travel policy to Cuba. And I'm wondering, the different policies and how we treated travel to the different countries,
right.
did it ever make sense? And if not, why do those policies still remain in place?
Yeah, I will remember that I served in Moscow, and during those years in the 1960s, we always encouraged American citizens to travel to the Soviet Union. We thought that the travel of Americans was a good way to let light into that vast country. And I don't say that that's what brought about the transformation of the Soviet Union, but it certainly didn't hurt. We accomplished more with that than we do with our policy toward Cuba. Yeah, it's only with Cuba. Cuba's the only country where Americans can't travel. That simply makes no sense at all. Could I comment on your
the chairman
earlier question? The thrust of your question to Mr. Kelly seemed to be that we haven't made any progress in our hope to bring about compensation for the nationalized properties. We have not tried to do that. That has not been the objective of the policy. As Mr. Kelly was saying, I was director of Cuban affairs as we first opened interest sections, and the chief of the Cuban interest section and I immediately began talking about compensation and a timetable for lifting the embargo. We thought that's what we were going to do. Others had something to say about it, and we didn't do that. But the fact that Cuba has reached compensation agreements with every state except the United States, with every other country that had claims against Cuba. It hasn't, and it has over and over again indicated its willingness to negotiate a compensation agreement with us. In a nutshell, though you won't get anybody in the Department of State to actually say this, the reason we haven't reached agreement with Cuba is we're not willing to sit down and negotiate a compensation agreement. Because if we did, that would mean lifting the embargo, would mean a long step toward normalization, which we have not, understandably, which we have not been able, have not been willing to take. So our policy has not been one aimed at bringing about a compensation negotiation.
So really, we haven't wanted that long-term resolution, or
we want it, but under
we've not been willing to act on it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you for your comments, Dr. Smith, and thank you for the chairman being so indulgent.
Thank you. Chairs, please recognize Mr. Herger.
Thank you very much. Chairman Tanner, I want to thank you for holding this very important hearing on U.S. Cuba policy. This has been very helpful. I want to thank each of our witnesses for outstanding testimony. I think it is long past time that we be addressing this issue, so I want to commend each of you. I noted that virtually every witness has expressed support for H.R. 4645, the Travel Restriction Reform Export Enhancement Act. However, that legislation has not been referred to Ways and Means Committee. I would note that there are many trade issues that are squarely within our jurisdiction that are not being addressed as we hold this hearing. Mr. Brilliant, your position with regard to Cuba seems to be completely consistent with the Chamber's position on trade policy more broadly. Is it safe to say that the Chamber supports trade liberalization, not just with Cuba, but with all countries in the hemisphere and around the world? And how important is it that the United States pursue a broad and aggressive strategy of opening foreign markets to U.S. exports? And what are ramifications for American workers if we do not?
Thank you, Congressman. Well, first of all, to the first question, yes, a resounding yes. We, of course, want to see a vigorous trade agenda, and we believe that America is standing still right now on the sidelines while Europe and the Japanese and the Chinese are pursuing very aggressively trade arrangements around the world that compromise our ability to export and, frankly, undermine the ability to create jobs for our workers. So while we applauded the President's determination in the State of the Union to talk about doubling exports, that's not enough. We need action. So we very much support trade liberalization, and we think the United States needs to be at the forefront of that by pursuing trade agreements, passing the pending FTAs, and frankly going even further than that. And I have said already that 50 million Americans are employed in jobs that are linked to exports, and I would just say to Congressman Brady's point earlier, we expect $13 billion of increased exports if we pass the 3 FTAs, and we think that's going to create a number of jobs in our country. But more importantly, it will signal that America is open for trade, and we need to take those steps now. So we very much appreciate the question, and of course we're going to support the committee and its action here.
Thank you, Mr. Brilliant. So it is interesting. It's so important that we be talking about Cuba. And again, I personally agree with each of you that we are a long time past. If we look at our going back, as you mentioned, Secretary Block, to the Reagan administration of opening up trade, opening up travel, doing the type of thing that will bring about their own people demanding better of their government, I think just makes perfect sense. Plus the fact that I represent one of the richest agricultural areas in the world in the northern Sacramento Valley, and we need these markets. And to just write them off to our competitors just doesn't make any sense. Mr. Kelly?
Yeah, I would just reiterate Mr. Brilliant's point. And if you look at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's international engagement agenda that they released, the first point on Chamber recommendations is that the United States should vigorously defend the rule of law, sanctity of contracts, and respect for property rights as central to our international investment policy.
And I thank you. And Dr. Smith, you were very good on pointing out that Cuba has been moving forward with this with other countries. They haven't with us. Maybe the reason is we maybe if we would begin doing what I think is being advocated here, and which I certainly support, maybe we could see that being addressed. Secretary Block?
I just wanted to comment briefly. I know that Mr. Brady and a number of you, and you also, Congressman, have these trade agreements as a very high priority. Even South Korea and Panama and Colombia. I do too. I mean, we all want to get those done. It's remarkable that they're just still sitting on the shelf. We've just got to get them done. Even in my home state of Illinois, John Deere and Caterpillar. Now, those are not farm products, but both of those companies could sell a lot of product down there in Venezuela, or rather in Colombia, if we opened that up and signed those trade agreements. And other countries, as has been pointed out by my colleagues here, are signing agreements, and we're just seeing markets taken away from us. And we've lost our markets in Cuba, too, because we're not aggressive. We're not willing to do business in a normal way. And I just think if the Congress would step up and push it, and hopefully the President will support this effort, we can create more jobs here in the United States, and we get our economy going better. We're forfeiting an opportunity all the time. Every day we sit on our hands, we're forfeiting an opportunity. Thank you for having this hearing and getting these issues on the top burner.
And thank you. And just to add to what you said, these same implement dealers in Illinois, the Panama is in the process of doubling the size of the Panama Canal to take deep port ships, and how well John Deere and Caterpillar could use that market as well. And they'll be losing it perhaps to the Canadians and others if we don't move forward. Thank you very much again, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your leadership here today.
Thank you, Mr. Herger. Chair has Mr. Kind. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to commend you for holding this very important hearing and thank the panel for your testimony here today. This is a conversation that's long overdue. I think it's acknowledged here today that the world's changed, this hemisphere has changed. Unfortunately, our policy, trade policy towards Cuba hasn't. And that's been a missed opportunity for many, many years. But it's also a bipartisan problem, and it's going to require a bipartisan solution in order to fix it. I do subscribe to the Cordell Hall of trade policy when he once said that when goods and products cross borders, armies don't. And I think that's replete throughout history. So this is more than just the economic benefits that opening up more trade with Cuba just off our coast could bring, but it's an important tool in our diplomatic arsenal. And I also believe that through greater opportunities for engagement, especially in the economic sphere, may lead to better changes and the reforms that all of us, I think, hope to see in Cuba for a better future for the people there. But Mr. Brilliant, let me start with you, because I know you touched upon it, and I forgot who was questioning you. But really, you know, the unstated fact is, for too long, I think, this issue has been dominated by just raw electoral politics in this country, especially how big a prize Florida has been in every presidential election. And you had indicated that some of the sentiment there with the Cuban families are changing in regards to their outlook regarding our policy towards Cuba and trade relations with Cuba. You think that's going to be enough in order to give some administration or someone running for president the courage to really take this on without fear of losing Florida in the next election?
Well, thank you, Congressman. First of all, I think Cordell Hull spoke those words at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce when he talked about the need.
I was about
the proudest moments he had
footnote, yeah.
was that he had accomplished a lot of trade agreements under his regime as Secretary of State. But I will say to you that I think there is obviously a change going on in the Cuban exile community, and that's clear by the polling, and we can provide that to the committee if it desires. But public opinion polling is shifting, and that's showing that more and more Cubans, and this may be second-generation Cubans living here, have a very different attitude and want to see increased trade and increased travel to Cuba happen. I would hope that would create the right atmosphere here in the Congress to take decisive action, and certainly the U.S. Chamber would support that action, as I believe the other groups around this table. So we'll do everything we can to support the bipartisan approach here, but I think it is appropriate at this time to revisit and to take action on H.R. 4645 as an important first step.
I appreciate that response, and you got to wonder and just scratch your head and you take a look at some of the regimes that we are actively trading with right now and how much different they are from Cuba even, and why this distinction is being made. But Mr. Kelly, you do raise a very important issue in regards to the property claims issue and the importance that we don't establish a bad precedent, that we're not willing to protect our own property interests when U.S. property is seized or nationalized and things like that. Do you see any other threats or any other countries that we should be concerned about by establishing a bad precedent with Cuba in this regards?
Well, typically when there are nationalizations, that comes in the wake of great social upheaval or political change. For instance, in Thailand, we have billions of dollars invested in Thailand, and they're undergoing, they underwent a coup in 2006, and they might undergo another one this year, who knows. When you have these unstable situations, that's when you have nationalizations occur, and that's when the new government that comes to power suddenly is cash-strapped and sees all these plump American assets lying about. And if a precedent is on the table that we're not going to defend the rights of our citizens abroad, then it might be easier to take those. And I was also happy to have you quote Cordell Hull. You may recall in the wake of the 1938 Mexican nationalization of the petroleum industry, Secretary Hull said that compensation should be prompt, effective, and adequate. And those words, prompt, effective, and adequate, have made it into almost every bilateral investment treaty that we've got.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, property claims and disposals can get messy. Especially with Cuban exiles, Cuban families that have had their properties taken from them. You've got new people living there, utilizing them. Are there any lessons to be learned of what happened throughout Eastern Europe after the collapse of communism and all the property claims that inevitably took place in those countries that might help the process as it relates to Cuba?
Well, several models emerged in East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland. Some have been more successful than others. Some have been more creative than others. I think one of the most creative solutions was the Hungarian solution, and they combined compensation for property confiscation with privatization of state-owned industries after communism. So the compensation was in the form of security vouchers that amounted to stocks in the newly privatized corporations, and they built up their stock market, and the people that were compensated for the property confiscations began to trade and use these vouchers to buy agricultural land and more stock in corporations, and they used that to drive their move towards capitalism. So there are some creative approaches you can take. That would probably be more appropriate for the Cuban claims than the American national claims.
All right. Thank you. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kine. Mr. Nunes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I do not support liberalization of trade with Cuba, a nation governed by a brutal communist dictatorship. To justify this initiative, some may draw parallels with China or other foreign powers that have been hostile to American freedom. But make no mistake, Cuba is not China, and these comparisons are not valid, and here's a few reasons why. Cuba, not China, is stoking anti-American sentiment throughout the Western Hemisphere and is openly hostile to our nation. Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism, along with Iran, Syria, and Sudan. Cuba is one of a handful of totalitarian states remaining in the world alongside Burma and North Korea. Trade with Cuba means trade with one company, Allimport. Any talk of open trade with Cuba is a distortion. What we are talking about is open trade with Castro's import-export regime. Let me be clear, I am not defending Chinese currency manipulation, and I believe the U.S. has many challenges ahead with respect to our relationship with China, but it is inappropriate and dangerous to use the China model of engagement for a brutal totalitarian regime in Cuba. And while I understand that American foreign policy has taken a bold new look and feel under the Obama administration, I am compelled to ask a basic question. Is this Congress seriously proposing to advance trade with terrorist states before completing work on agreements with democratic allies and strategic partners? Trade with Cuba is not a question of economics. It is a matter of geopolitics and American national security. I recognize that liberalization might make a few Americans a lot of money, and I don't blame certain elements of our economy, including the California Farm Bureau, for entertaining profits over the larger ideals of freedom and national security. I'd like to draw your attention to the first slide here. To my knowledge, no members of the California Farm Bureau have been murdered for their political views. Here's a picture depicting Cubans murdered by the Castro regime, a memorial to them in Miami, Florida. I'd like to bring up the second slide now. And it might come as a surprise to supporters of trade with Cuba that killing a cow in that country without government permission results in longer prison sentences than killing a human being. The California Farm Bureau and other exporters do not represent this nation's national interest. The American people are tired of sectional interests governing our country. As leaders, we are charged with the responsibility of putting aside these narrow interests in favor of the national interest. As a representative from California's #1 agricultural district, I can assure you I have done so in respect with China. Yet I fear many of my colleagues have lost sight of their responsibility. While we discuss trade with Cuba, this committee has sat idle while congressional leaders have blocked consideration of vital agreements with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea. Our allies in Central and South America are under constant assault by hostile powers, including Venezuela's Hugo Chavez. Without our support, we leave these friendly democracies at the mercy of anti-American sentiment and militant Marxist ideology. So I ask, when will the House consider the Colombian, Panamanian, and South Korean agreements? And while we're asking questions, I would also like to know why so many anti-trade Democrats, those responsible for holding up consideration of important free trade agreements with our Democratic allies, are so intent on liberalizing trade with the communist dictatorship in Cuba. I understand that some in this House may share the Marxist views of Castro and Chavez, but we must all recognize that American freedom is incompatible with these regimes. And quite frankly, with so many opportunities to enhance trade relationships with democracies, it is utterly incomprehensible that time and tax dollars are being wasted on Cuba. Yet here we sit. I urge my Democratic colleagues to take a stand one way or another, either in the waiting game currently confronting our allies, those allies being Colombia, South Korea, and Panama, and give them a vote on their trade agreements, or kill them now and get on with your agenda. Perhaps some of my colleagues would be more comfortable negotiating free trade agreements with Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, and Cuba. I yield back.
You don't have a question for the panel?
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pascrell, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the hearing. I guess I'm an anomaly here. Not on this subcommittee, but I appreciate the fact that you allowed me.
Sir, you're always welcome here. You know that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. While I do not agree in what my good friend Mr. Nunes says is a liberalization of trade, I certainly don't agree with Mr. Nunes, with due respect, what he says about the agreements, possible or potential agreements with South Korea, Colombia particularly, since we know that that agreement as it appears right now before us would absolutely be a disservice to the automobile industry of this nation as it stands and as it is written right now. We want trade agreements, I thought, that were fair, in your words, non-selective or non-regional to the entire nation. I think that's exactly what we look at for. Mr. Brillant represents an organization that I never known to disagree with a trade agreement. When I look back at all the agreements over the past 20 years that were real or potential, the Chamber had very little to say about who we were trading with, only something to say about what we were trading. I would think that many of our trade agreements compromised American values. NAFTA exposed is an absolute disgrace. It did not stop immigration to the United States of America at all. It did not support the Mexican economy at all. So I think we've sacrificed fairness. We've sacrificed certainly our manufacturing sector. Where was the Chamber when high-paying jobs, well-paying jobs were lost, destroyed? So I wouldn't be too quick to jump into Cuba on the basis that our markets are looking for a place. We are all aware in this room of the reality that Cuba is currently a totalitarian state. Mr. Nunez's comments should not be taken lightly. Everything is controlled by the regime. We also know that the regime prohibits union organizing. Let's talk about union organizing, because it seems to be at the very center of every deal, trade agreement we talk about, be it on this committee or any other. Let's get really down to the facts. The outlawing of independent labor unions and the absence of the right to strike or collective bargaining appear to me to be in violation of the ILO conventions. Is this accurate, Mr. Brilliant? Yes, sir.
Well, obviously, I respect the views of every member of Congress, and I respect your views. I differ with them in many material respects. First of all, I served until recently as president of the U.S. Korea Business Council, and I was the advocate that encouraged Rob Portman, when he was trade rep, to pursue that FTA.
Mr. Brilliant, in all due respect, a very simple question. The outlawing of independent labor unions and the absence of the right to strike or collective bargaining appear to me to be in violation of ILO conventions. I simply asked you.
I don't have a direct opinion on that, other than to say that if you're talking about the FTAs that are outstanding, we've had tremendous progress. And you're talking about a country of South Korea that has a very open labor market.
So you don't know if this is accurate or not, what I'm saying?
Look, I know what is accurate.
What is accurate then? Tell me.
When we pursue trade agreements, when we pursue trade agreements, we are protecting and encouraging.
Tell me a trade agreement you disagree with over the last 20 years.
Well, I'm about to tell you that we're going to put out a study that demonstrates that millions of jobs have been developed because of the trade agreements that we do have in place.
No, you can't answer the question. Let me continue, if I may, sir. In 2008, 3 Cuban defectors won an $80 million judgment in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Florida against Kurioco Dry Dock Company, a foreign company, for conspiring with the Cuban government to force labor. Here's my question to the panel. Considering the above-noted case, and I'm sure you're all familiar, being all experts in trade, in the many other documented instances of abuses in labor, how can the United States, in good conscience, allow such investment as being advocated today on both sides of the table with the Castro regime without exacerbating these internationally condemned legal practices? Who would respond to that on the panel?
Can I comment just very quickly, Mr. Pascal? The Cuba issues that are under discussion today involve U.S. sales to Cuba and U.S. travel to Cuba, and they don't involve U.S. investment to Cuba. I don't think there's much question that everyone on this panel agrees that there's serious labor rights problems in Cuba. I would point out that the AFL has called for us to take another look at our policy on travel to Cuba and sales to Cuba because they see it as a way to move on.
Well, I'm not a representative of the AFL-CIO. I'm here as an independent congressman from the state of New Jersey trying to seek fairness, as you are. And my question is very specific. Wouldn't these agreements exacerbate the internationally condemned legal practices which have been accepted in the world? Yes or no? If we think that these practices should continue, if we think that these practices should not be changed, fine. Or if we think we can't do anything about them, say so. Mr. Block?
I don't think I can answer your question as specific as you're asking it, but the reality is, are all these other countries around the world wrong? And they trade with Cuba, they do business with Cuba. Is Canada wrong? Are the Brits wrong? Is everybody wrong? And that's the first point I'd make. The second point I would make is if it's going to be so bad for labor to trade with Cuba, maybe we ought to quit trading with China. Would you advocate that?
I tried to be specific, Mr. Block. In conclusion, I extended my time. If I may. I tried to be specific for this reason. I've heard several times on the panel that we should go back to the old Cuba, where we traded, where everything was just hunky-dory. Well, when we look at the government pre the revolution, and I certainly am not supportive of that revolution, nor am I a communist sympathizer. Okay. When you go back to that situation, you realize that this was a supposedly democratic government, which was brutal.
Conclude, please. We're running out of time, seriously.
I will conclude. And my point is that I don't want to go back to that kind of a Cuba. And I'd be afraid at this point to ask you if you would. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pomeroy, you have the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend Mr. Nunes for his fine statement. My goodness, just close my eyes, and it's like going to a Cold War museum. You could have heard the same speech in 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s. How nice of you, Mr. Nunes, to have these timeless arguments brought to our attention this morning. You even got a dash of McCarthyism in there. Nice touch. But let's talk to expertise on the panel that actually served as leaders in our government during the time when we are in the Cold War and taking steps to ultimately win the Cold War. Secretary Block, how good to see you again. What were the considerations around the cabinet table of President Reagan as they considered trade questions as a tool for ultimately prevailing in the Cold War and liberalizing areas of the world that now are in a very different place from where they were when you were our secretary?
Congressman, it is a pleasure to see you again, too, I might add. We had some good days back there, too. Well, to build upon the point I made earlier, when President Reagan decisively just lifted the grain trade sanctions and opened up trade with the Soviet Union, within the next 2 or 3 years, or next 2 years, I started negotiating a long-term grain trade agreement with them. And then that was signed. In fact, I went to Moscow and signed it with Minister Potolachev. So President Reagan did support trade, and he thought that it was a good thing for us. Listen, in one respect, one way he looked at it was, here we have all this grain, and we just send them the grain, and then we take their money. Isn't that good for us? And so that's what we did. And he also felt that engagement was a good thing. Hopefully, maybe over time, we could bring about change. And
history does not regard President Ronald Reagan as soft on communism, not anyway.
He never was soft on communism.
Well, let's continue, Mr. Secretary. The H.R. 4645, the Travel Restriction Reform and Export Enhancement Act. I mean, this is a measured step. We're not talking about a free trade agreement here, is it? is there a way to get the 2005 Treasury Department restrictions, which have been so damaging to what was an opening market for our farmers? Do we need to pass legislation to do that? Do you believe that could just be reversed by the administration, or do you think the statute itself is the best way to proceed? And Mr. Brilliant, if I'd like you to answer that one as well, if you would. You going to go first?
Well, I think if your question is what's the best way to go forward, I think taking the incremental step of having bipartisan legislation address the travel and agricultural aspects of our trade with Cuba is the way to go.
Could the administration have taken this step unilaterally, or do they need our law?
As I understand it, no. They need the Congress to act.
Okay.
But I will just make one other point, which I think is that I think the administration needs to work and consult with the U.S. Congress on the best process to move forward with our policy towards Cuba.
I would just add that I think the administration can demonstrate leadership and conviction if they step forward and say, let's get this done. I mean, you just have to sometimes take the bull by the horns and move ahead. And if President Obama did this, I think it would get done. But if he's sitting back and not getting the trade agreement signed or voted on the trade agreements, not getting this done, nothing gets done. And is vitally important for jobs.
Relative to trade agreements, it's difficult on the one hand to be dealing with the national crisis of 10% unemployment and moving a bunch of trade deals concurrently. You know, things will sort out, but first things first. You got to, I believe, give some acknowledgement to what the administration has been up relative to the sorry state of our economy. Whether or not the administration weighs in on this bill, I commend my colleagues, Congressman Peterson, Chairman of the Ag Committee, Congressman Moran, for doing precisely that. I'm pleased to support them in the effort to push this bill. And thank you very much for a distinguished and insightful panel for your comments today. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. I think that concludes the members' questioning. I want to thank all of you. It's been, I think, as Earl said, very constructive. Mr. Brady, thank you. And we will be holding some more hearings on some of these topics. Thank you all very much. We stand adjourned.